His palm hit the heavy oak door with a dull, final thud, inches from her face. The lock clicked shut under his weight. Audrey didn't flinch, but her grip on the duffel bag tightened until her knuckles went white. Nico wasn't yelling. He didn't have to. The blood drying on his collar said enough. He leaned in, his voice a gravelly whisper that cut straight through the deafening silence of the foyer. "Tell me the truth before you leave." The penthouse was suffocatingly quiet, the kind of silence that only exists 50 floors above a restless city. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston was drowning in a November downpour, the streetlights bleeding into distorted orange streaks against the glass. Audrey stood in the center of the walk-in closet, staring at an open canvas duffel bag. She wasn't packing silk. She wasn't packing the diamonds Nico had casually tossed onto her vanity over the last 2 years, or the designer dresses that hung in perfectly color-coordinated rows like soldiers awaiting inspection. She packed heavy cotton sweaters, a pair of worn-in denim jeans, and thick wool socks. Practical things, things that belonged to a ghost. Her movements were mechanical, stripped of hesitation. She folded a black turtleneck, the fabric soft beneath her trembling fingers, and pressed it into the corner of the bag. Next came the envelopes. 3 thick manila envelopes, wrapped in rubber bands, heavy with untraceable cash. She shoved them beneath the clothing, burying them. Every item she placed in the bag felt like a nail in a coffin she was building for herself. Living with Nico Moretti had never been a fairy tale. Audrey wasn't naive. She was a forensic auditor who had spent her career tracing hidden assets and bleeding corporate ledgers. She knew what men like Nico did in the dark. She knew where the money came from. But she had also known the way his hand felt against the small of her back when the rest of the world dissolved, the quiet vulnerability in his eyes when he woke up from the night terrors he swore he didn't have. Love in this world wasn't a saving grace. It was leverage, and right now, someone was using it. Her phone buzzed on the granite island in the kitchen, a harsh vibration against the stone. Audrey didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. The burner phone had only received messages from one number. 30 minutes. That was the deal. She had 30 minutes to vanish, to take the fall for the discrepancy in the shipping manifests, or her younger brother Ian would be found floating in the Charles River before sunrise. Ian was an idiot, a gambling addict who thought he could outsmart the local bookies, who in turn were kicked up to the Moretti syndicate. He had leveraged her name, her proximity to Nico, to secure a debt he could never pay. The rival families smelled blood in the water. They wanted a mole, or they wanted a body. Audrey had chosen to be the mole, not to betray Nico, but to run away looking like she had, drawing the heat, severing the tie. She zipped the duffel bag. The brass teeth caught halfway, snagging on a piece of fabric. Audrey yanked it hard. It tore the cotton, but the zipper closed. She slung the strap over her shoulder, the weight of it digging immediately into her collarbone. She took one last look at the bedroom. The unmade, king-sized bed. The empty glass of bourbon on Nico's nightstand. The faint, lingering scent of bergamot and gun oil. It smelled like safety. It smelled like a lie. She turned off the bedroom light, plunging the room into shadows, and walked down the long, gallery-style hallway. Her boots made no sound on the imported Persian runners. She moved like a thief in her own home. In her head, she calculated the variables. Nico was in the North End at a sit-down with the regional captains. He wasn't expected back until 3 in the morning. Dante, his shadow and head enforcer, was with him. The penthouse guards were stationed in the lobby and the underground garage. If she took the service elevator down to the 4th floor, crossed over the maintenance bridge to the adjacent high-rise, and took their commercial elevator down to the alley, she would bypass the security entirely. She had planned this with the same cold, calculating efficiency she used to dismantle offshore shell companies. No emotion. just data. She reached the massive foyer. The floor was black marble, polished to a mirror shine. Above her, a minimalist chandelier cast harsh, angular shadows across the walls. The front door loomed ahead, solid, reinforced oak with a biometric lock. Audrey raised her hand to the keypad. Her fingers hovered over the glowing numbers. She closed her eyes, inhaling a sharp, ragged breath. Just walk out. Do not look back. If you look back, you're dead. She punched in the 6-digit code. Click. The deadbolt retracted with a heavy, satisfying thunk. She reached for the brass handle. Behind her, the soft, barely perceptible hum of the private elevator shuddered through the walls. Audrey froze. The blood drained from her face, pooling cold in her stomach. The private elevator didn't stop on the lower floors. It came straight from the secure garage. No. She gripped the handle, pulling the heavy oak door inward, desperate to slip through the crack before the elevator arrived. Ding! The chime echoed through the cavernous foyer like a gunshot. The polished steel doors of the elevator slid open. Audrey stopped. The door cracked open just 2 inches, the cold draft of the hallway brushing against her face. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The air in the room seemed to undergo a sudden, violent shift in pressure, heavy and suffocating. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. The heavy tread of leather-soled shoes against the marble. "I'd ask where you're going," a voice rasped, dark and resonant, stripped of any warmth. "But it's raining, and you hate the rain. So it must be important." Audrey closed her eyes. It was him. Audrey let go of the door handle. It swung back slightly, leaving only a sliver of the hallway visible. She turned around, her spine rigid, her face locked into a mask of professional indifference. Nico stood 10 feet away. He looked like hell. His tailored charcoal suit, usually immaculate, was soaked at the shoulders, the wool darkened by the rain. His tie was gone, the top 2 buttons of his crisp white shirt ripped open. But it was the blood that caught her eye. It was smeared across his left knuckles, already drying into a rusty brown, and a single stark drop stained the collar of his shirt like a morbid ruby. His dark hair was pushed back, wet and messy. His jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked violently near his ear. But his eyes, dark, calculating and frighteningly calm, were locked onto her. They flicked from her pale face, down to the heavy canvas bag slung over her shoulder, and then back up. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't rush her. He just stood there, letting the silence stretch, until it felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. "Sit down ended early," Nico said, his voice terrifyingly conversational. He reached up, wincing slightly as he unbuttoned his cuffs. Negotiations broke down. Frankie thought he had leverage. He didn't. Audrey swallowed hard. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper. "Are you hurt?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. A reflex, a remnant of the woman who used to patch him up on the bathroom counter. Nico's hands paused on his right cuff. He looked at her, really looked at her, and the mask of calm slipped just a fraction, revealing something jagged and wounded underneath. "Not physically," he murmured. He tossed his cufflinks onto the marble credenza. They landed with a sharp clatter. He took a slow step forward. Audrey instinctively took a half step back, her shoulder bumping against the heavy oak door. "I have to go, Nico," she said. Her voice was steady, projecting a confidence she didn't possess. "Move out of the way." Nico didn't stop walking until he was less than 3 feet from her. The smell of him washed over her. Rainwater, copper, and that deep, familiar scent of cedarwood. It was intoxicating. It made her want to drop the bag and bury her face in his chest, to let him handle the monsters in the dark. But he was the monster in the dark. "Go where?" Nico asked, tilting his head. "It's 2 a.m, Audrey. The roads are flooded. The city is asleep." "Away, away," he repeated, tasting the word, finding it bitter. He looked at the duffel bag again. "You're packing light for away. You left the passport in the safe. I checked." Panic flared in her chest, hot and sharp. He checked the safe? When? He had just walked through the door. "I don't need it," Audrey lied, keeping her chin up. "I'm staying domestic. I need space. From this. From you." Nico's eyes darkened. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Space. Yes, after 2 years of sharing my bed, knowing my ledgers, knowing my enemies. Nico took another step, closing the distance. He reached out. Audrey flinched, but he only caught the thick canvas strap of her duffel bag. He tested its weight with his fingers. "You think you can just pack a bag of sweaters and walk out the front door because you need space? It's over, Nico." She forced the words out, making them as cold and brutal as possible. She needed him to hate her. It was the only way he would let her go without looking closer. "I'm tired of the paranoia. I'm tired of checking over my shoulder. I'm tired of washing blood out of your shirts. I don't love this life, and I don't love you enough to die for it." She waited for the explosion. She waited for the infamous Moretti temper that had leveled rival crews and shattered rooms. Instead, Nico laughed. It was a hollow, scraping sound. He let go of the strap. "You're a terrible liar, Audrey. You're a brilliant accountant, but a catastrophic liar." "I'm telling you the truth," she snapped, stepping to the side, reaching for the door handle again. Nico moved faster than she could track. Before her fingers even brushed the brass, his hand slammed flat against the heavy oak door, pressing it firmly into the frame. The lock clicked back into place, under his weight. He leaned his forearm against the wood, effectively caging her between his body, the wall, and the door. Audrey gasped, her back pressed flat against the wood. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The exhaustion etched into the lines around his mouth was suddenly obvious. He looked exhausted. He looked betrayed. "You don't get to run," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Not from me." "You don't own me," she shot back, her chest heaving. "I'm not one of your soldiers, Nico." "No," he agreed softly, his dark eyes tracing the line of her jaw. "You're not. You're the woman who stayed awake for 3 days when I caught a bullet in my ribs. You're the woman who stared down Dante when he disrespected you, and the woman who organizes my offshore accounts over morning coffee." He leaned in closer, his lips mere inches from her ear. "You don't care about the blood, Audrey. You never did." She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting the prickle of tears. "People change. Situations change," Nico corrected, pulling back just enough to force her to look at him. "People don't. You're running. But you're not running from me." He brought his free hand up, his knuckles grazing her cheek. She tried to turn her head away, but he caught her chin, his grip firm but gentle, forcing her to hold his gaze. "Tell me the truth before you leave," he demanded quietly. "I did," Audrey whispered, her voice cracking. "Bullshit." Nico's thumb stroked her jawline, a terrifyingly tender gesture contrasting with the lethal tension in his frame. "If you were leaving because you stopped loving me, you would have looked me in the eye and said it. You wouldn't be sneaking out the service corridors like a thief in the middle of a storm. I didn't want a scene. You're a coward," he countered softly, the word striking her like a physical blow. "You're many things, Audrey, but you're not a coward. So, I'll ask you again. What is in the bag? Clothes. And? Nothing. Nico stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. Then, in one swift motion, he stepped back, grabbed the bottom of the duffel bag, and upended it. "Hey!" Audrey lunged, but it was too late. The zipper burst the rest of the way. Clothes tumbled out onto the black marble floor. Sweaters, jeans, socks. And then, hitting the stone with a heavy, unmistakable slap, the 3 thick manila envelopes. They slid across the floor, coming to a stop near the toe of Nico's ruined leather shoe. The silence rushed back in, thicker and heavier than before. Nico looked down at the envelopes. Then he looked at her. The softness in his expression vanished, replaced by the cold, dead-eyed calculation of a boss who had just found a rat in his house. $300,000, Nico stated, not asking a question. Untraceable cash from the emergency lockbox. The lockbox only 2 people have the code to. Audrey's breathing went shallow. She backed up against the door, feeling the cold brass handle dig into her spine. I was taking my severance. Severance! He nudged one of the envelopes with his foot. From a syndicate, that's funny. He slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. Who is squeezing you? No one. Don't lie to me, Audrey. Not now. I just spent the last 3 hours tearing apart a room full of men because I found out someone inside my organization leaked a shipping route. A route only you, me, and Dante had access to. Audrey's heart stopped. She stared at him, the blood turning to ice in her veins. He knew. I didn't leak it, she breathed, the panic finally breaking through her carefully constructed facade. Nico, I swear to God, I didn't leak the route. I know you didn't, Nico said, taking a slow step toward her. The anger wasn't gone, but it was morphing into something else, something darker. Because Dante ran the trace. The leak came from an IP address in Southie, a rundown apartment leased to a kid named Ian Hayes. Audrey felt her knees buckle. She slumped against the door, sliding down a few inches before Nico's hand shot out, grabbing her by the bicep, holding her upright. He's an idiot, she choked out, the tears finally spilling over, hot and humiliating. He's just a stupid kid, Nico. He got in deep with the Rossi family. They found out he was my brother. They squeezed him. They threatened to kill him if he didn't get them something. Nico's grip tightened on her arm. And instead of coming to me, you let him steal my manifests? I didn't know, she cried, pushing against his chest. But he didn't budge. I didn't know until tonight. They called me. They said they have him. They said if I don't bring the money and take the fall, they'll send him back to me in pieces. And you were just going to do it. Nico's voice was dangerously quiet now, a lethal hush. You were going to walk out that door, take the blame for a leak that would have started a war, and hand yourself over to the Rossi family. I have to protect him. He is a liability, Nico roared, the sudden explosion of sound making Audrey flinch violently. The echo bounced off the marble walls, sharp and violent. Nico let go of her arm, running a hand through his wet hair, pacing a tight circle in the foyer. He stole from me, Audrey. In my world, that is a death sentence. Blood or not. He's my brother, she whispered, sliding down the door until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in her hands. The fight was gone. The adrenaline crash left her shaking. He's all I have left. If he dies, it's on me. Nico stopped pacing. He stood over her, breathing heavily, the adrenaline of the night still vibrating in his muscles. He looked down at the woman who had anchored him for 2 years, now a crumpled, weeping mess on his floor. Slowly the tension bled out of his shoulders. He knelt down on the hard marble, ignoring the protest of his own bruised ribs. He reached out, wrapping his large, calloused hands around her wrists, pulling them gently away from her face. "Look at me," he commanded. Audrey opened her eyes. They were red-rimmed and terrified. "You're not going to the Rossis," Nico said, his voice returning to that low, steady rumble. "You are going to take your bag. You are going to go into the bedroom. And you are going to lock the door." "Nico, they'll kill him." "They won't touch him," Nico interrupted, his thumb wiping a tear from her cheek. The coldness in his eyes had returned, but it wasn't directed at her anymore. It was directed outward, at the city, at the men who had dared to touch what was his. "Because they're not dealing with an accountant anymore. They're dealing with me." He stood up, towering over her. He reached under his ruined suit jacket and unholstered his heavy matte black sidearm. He checked the magazine with a sharp, metallic click, then slid it back into the holster. "I'm going to get your idiot brother," Nico said, turning toward the elevator. "And then I'm going to burn the Rossi family to the ground." He paused at the doors, looking back at her over his shoulder. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by the lethal predator she had always known he was. "Don't be here when I get back if you can't live with the ashes." The elevator doors closed, leaving Audrey alone in the silence, staring at the scattered money on the floor. Dante cut the engine 2 blocks from the meatpacking district. The idling hum of the SUV died, replaced by the relentless drumming of rain against the armored glass. Nico sat in the passenger seat, his face illuminated only by the faint green glow of the dashboard clock. It was 2:40 in the morning. He unclipped his seatbelt. The synthetic click was deafening in the heavy silence. Dante didn't look at him. He didn't need to. They had operated in this exact frequency for a decade. A silent, shared language of impending violence. Dante racked the slide of his heavy Glock. 3 men on the outer perimeter, Dante murmured, staring through the rain-streaked windshield. 2 by the loading dock, 1 smoking near the chain-link fence. Inside, unknown. Rossi wouldn't hold a high-value hostage without a dozen bodies. Nico adjusted the collar of his ruined suit jacket. The dried blood flaked off his knuckles. He felt hollowed out, a cold void sitting where his chest used to be. Audrey's face, pale and terrified, flickered in his mind. He pushed it away. Emotion got men killed. Cold math kept them breathing. "Take the dock," Nico instructed firmly. "I want the front door." They stepped out into the heavy downpour. The cold hit Nico instantly, soaking through his thin dress shirt, chilling the nervous sweat on his skin. He walked with measured, unhurried steps down the cracked asphalt of the dark alleyway. Water pooled in the deep potholes, reflecting the sickly yellow glow of the sodium street lamps. The smell of rotting garbage and wet concrete filled his lungs. He felt the heavy, comforting weight of the Sig Sauer resting against his ribs. He unholstered it, letting it hang loosely by his thigh. The guard by the fence never even saw him coming. Nico raised the weapon and fired twice. The suppressed shot sounded like heavy staples driving into thick wood. The man crumpled, his lit cigarette hissing rapidly as it hit a deep puddle. Nico stepped over the dead body without breaking his stride. To his left, a heavy metallic clang echoed loudly from the loading dock, followed by a muffled gurgle. Dante was remarkably efficient. Nico reached the rusted side door of the massive warehouse. It was firmly locked. He stepped back, raised his right leg, and violently kicked the lock mechanism with the flat of his heavy leather dress shoe. The door slammed inward, rebounding off the cinder block wall. The interior was cavernous, smelling of copper, old grease, and damp earth. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sickly, flickering pallor over the massive space. In the center of the room, tied tightly to a folding metal chair, was Ian. The kid looked atrocious. His face was a swollen mass of purple and black, his bottom lip split wide open. Standing around him were 5 men. At the head of the pack was Leo Rossi, a thick-necked enforcer with a penchant for cheap cologne and unnecessary cruelty. Leo turned around quickly. Nico didn't give them a chance to speak. No monologues. No negotiations. That time had passed the moment they touched Audrey's blood. He raised his weapon. The warehouse erupted into deafening chaos. Unsuppressed gunfire shattered the air. Concrete dust rained down as bullets chewed the walls. Nico moved laterally, his boots finding purchase on the slick, greasy floor. He fired in tight, controlled bursts. 2 men went down before they could clear their holsters. A third caught a round in the collarbone, spinning wildly before Dante's rifle cut him down from the elevated loading dock catwalk, high above the floor. Leo scrambled behind a rusted forklift, firing blindly over his shoulder. The sharp crack of his revolver echoed through the massive room. A bullet whined past Nico's ear, close enough to leave a phantom heat against his skin. Nico ignored it. He advanced with predatory patience. He flanked the heavy forklift, his weapon trained on the gap between the iron tines. Leo tried to reload, his thick fingers fumbling with the speed loader. His breath hitched as he looked up and found the black hollow of Nico's barrel pointed directly at his sweaty face. The entire warehouse fell dead silent. "Moretti!" Leo gasped, dropping the loose cartridges. They scattered across the concrete floor like broken teeth. "Wait, we can make a deal. The kid owes us. He stole from you, too. We did you a massive favor." Nico looked at the desperate man. He didn't see a rival boss. He saw a dead man who had caused the woman he loved to cry on his foyer floor. "You don't do me favors," Nico said. The gravel in his deep voice was absolute. "And you don't touch what belongs to me." He pulled the trigger. Leo slumped against the rusted machinery. Nico lowered his gun. The acrid smell of cordite burned his nostrils. He turned toward the center of the bloody room. Ian was hyperventilating, his chest heaving against the thick nylon ropes binding him to the metal chair. Tears tracked through the grime and blood on the kid's bruised face. He looked pathetic. He looked exactly like a massive liability. Nico walked over, pulling a switchblade from his dark pocket. The metallic snick of the blade deploying made Ian flinch violently, a whimpering sound escaping his dry throat. "Shut up!" Nico ordered. He sliced through the heavy ropes instantly. Ian spilled forward onto his hands and knees, gagging, coughing up blood onto the dirty concrete. Nico stood over him, watching him with absolute disgust. "Get up!" Nico commanded loudly. Ian struggled, his limbs trembling uncontrollably. Dante materialized from the dark shadows, his rifle slung across his broad back. He didn't look at the scattered bodies. He just looked at Ian. "Can he walk?" Dante asked, his tone devoid of any empathy. "He'll walk," Nico replied, grabbing the collar of Ian's jacket and hauling him roughly to his feet. "Or I'll drag him. We're done here." "Burn the building." Audrey sat on the edge of the unmade king-sized bed. The digital clock on the nightstand read 4:30 in the morning. The heavy rain had stopped, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence that pressed against her eardrums. The penthouse felt like a tomb. She hadn't packed the bag again. The canvas duffel still sat in the massive foyer, the manila envelopes of cash resting exactly where Nico had spilled them. She had tried to pick them up, but her hands had shaken so violently she couldn't grip the paper. She just left them there. A monument to her spectacular failure. She stared at the city lights blinking through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Don't be here when I get back, if you can't live with the ashes." His harsh words echoed in the dark bedroom, rattling inside her skull. It was an out. He had given her a legitimate exit. She could take the money, walk out the front door, and never look back. He wouldn't hunt her. Nico was ruthless, but he wasn't a liar. If he said she could go, The door was wide open. But walking away meant abandoning Ian entirely. It meant leaving Nico alone in the dark. She knew exactly what was happening in Southie right now. She knew the mechanics of Nico's violent wrath. She had seen the aftermath in ledgers, the sudden disappearance of payroll names, the sudden influx of territory assets. It was clean on paper. It was a slaughter in reality. By staying, she was accepting that blood. She was stamping her name onto the ledger of his dark sins. Audrey closed her eyes, pressing the heels of her hands against them until stars burst in her vision. She loved him. It was a terrifying realization. She loved the monster entirely and completely. The soft hum of the private elevator vibrated through the hardwood floorboards. Audrey's breath caught in her dry throat. She stood up, her legs feeling exactly like heavy lead. The mechanism engaged loudly. The doors slid open in the silent foyer. The heavy, dragging sound of footsteps echoed down the long gallery hallway. She walked out of the dark bedroom, crossing the thick Persian runner. The lights in the foyer were still harsh and incredibly bright. Standing over the scattered money was Nico. He was holding a body up by the scruff of its jacket. It was her brother. "Ian!" Audrey gasped softly. She rushed forward, sliding to her knees on the cold marble floor. Nico let go of the torn jacket. Ian collapsed in a heavy heap, groaning as his bruised ribs hit the hard stone. Audrey pulled her brother's heavy head onto her lap. His face was unrecognizable. His left eye was swollen shut, a nasty laceration cutting deeply across his eyebrow. He reeked of cheap warehouse dirt, stale sweat, and dried blood. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hands fluttering over his broken face. "Ian, can you hear me? Just look at me right now." Ian groaned loudly, his one good eye slitting open slowly. He looked up at her, deep confusion and sharp pain warping his young features. "Audrey," he rasped, coughing weakly into his hand. "I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. I messed up everything." He sounded like a frightened little boy, not a street hustler, not a brazen gambler. Just a stupid kid who had played a dangerous game with devils and lost absolutely everything. Audrey smoothed his matted hair back from his forehead, hot tears pricking her tired eyes. "It's okay," she lied convincingly. "It's over. You're safe right now." She looked up, tearing her gaze away from her brother to look at the man who had brought him back. Nico leaned heavily against the thick oak door. He looked completely shattered inside. The adrenaline had burned out completely, leaving nothing but exhaustion and the physical toll of the extreme violence. His expensive suit was completely ruined. His hands were covered in a dark mixture of his own blood and the blood of the men he had just slaughtered. His dark eyes were fixed solely on her. He wasn't looking at Ian. He was looking directly at her pale face. He was searching her expression for the revulsion, the horror, the inevitable emotional rejection. He was waiting for her to grab her packed bag and run now that she had exactly what she wanted. The heavy air between them was incredibly thick with unspoken questions. "Are you leaving? Can you stomach this reality? Can you look at me and still see the man, or do you only see the brutal butcher?" Audrey slowly lowered Ian's injured head back onto the cold marble floor. She stood up carefully. Her stiff, aching knees popped loudly in the completely quiet and tense room. She walked past the scattered stacks of $100 bills. She didn't look at the dirty money. She walked straight to Nico. He stiffened as she approached, his jaw locking tight, fully bracing himself for the harsh slap, or the hysterical screaming, or the cold, final goodbye. She stopped inches from his chest. She reached up, her clean, manicured fingers gently grasping the lapels of his blood-soaked jacket. She didn't flinch at the metallic smell. She didn't look away from his hollowed-out, dark eyes. Slowly she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his hard chest, right over his racing heart. Nico froze instantly. For a terrifying second, he didn't move a single muscle. Then, with a shuddering breath that sounded exactly like a sob, his strong arms wrapped completely around her. He pulled her flush against his ruined body, burying his face deep in her soft hair. His grip was desperate, bone-crushing, and entirely vulnerable. "I'm still here," Audrey whispered against his ruined shirt, her voice remarkably steady. The city outside finally began to lighten slowly. The bloody ledger was balanced. The crushing debt was fully paid. She had looked at the dark ashes, and she had chosen the fire. The marble floor of the foyer was unforgiving, and Ian's groans grew louder as the initial shock of his rescue wore off, replaced by the crushing reality of his fractured ribs. Audrey didn't move from Nico's embrace. She stayed anchored against his ruined chest for a long, necessary minute, letting the erratic, hammering rhythm of his heart stabilize against her own. The heavy scent of gunpowder and dried blood was overwhelming, but she breathed it in deeply. It was the scent of a definitive choice. She had crossed the invisible line she had spent 2 years tiptoeing around. There was no plausible deniability left. The private elevator pinged softly behind them. The polished steel door slid open, revealing Dante. He stepped out into the bright foyer, his heavy combat boots tracking wet ash and dirty rainwater onto the pristine Persian runners. He took one look at the scattered stacks of $100 bills, then at Ian, bleeding on the floor, and finally at Nico and Audrey. His expression remained completely unchanged. Dante operated in a perpetual state of violent pragmatism. "The warehouse is ashes," Dante reported, his deep voice carrying no inflection. He dropped a heavy canvas medical kit onto the marble credenza. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. "Fire department won't get there for another 20 minutes. The rain is keeping the smoke low. But Leo Rossi's body is a cinder block by now." Nico finally pulled away from Audrey. The vulnerability that had gripped him just seconds ago vanished, meticulously boxed up and shoved into the darkest corner of his mind. The syndicate boss returned. He rolled his shoulders, wincing slightly as a bruised muscle protested the movement. "Good," Nico rasped. He looked down at Ian with eyes devoid of any lingering pity. "Get him off my floor, Dante. Patch him up in the guest suite. Do not give him painkillers. I want him awake and lucid when I explain exactly what his life is going to look like from this second forward." Ian whimpered, trying to push himself up on his trembling elbows. "Nico, please. I just need a day to rest. I can explain the debt." Dante didn't let him finish. He grabbed Ian by the back of his torn collar and hauled him to his feet with terrifying ease. Ian let out a sharp, choked gasp of pain as his broken ribs shifted. "Walk," Dante commanded, dragging the younger man down the long hallway toward the east wing. "Or I will break your legs and carry you." Audrey watched her brother stumble down the corridor, leaving small, dark droplets of blood on the polished hardwood. A week ago, she would have intervened. She would have yelled at Dante, demanded a hospital, and played the protective older sister. Tonight, she felt absolutely nothing. The maternal instinct that had driven her to pack that canvas duffel bag had burned out completely, incinerated in the warehouse fire alongside Leo Rossi. Ian was a grown man who had played a lethal game. The consequences were his to bear. Nico watched her closely, calculating her silence. "You can go to him," he offered quietly, though the tension in his jaw suggested he hoped she wouldn't. "Dante knows how to stitch a wound better than any trauma surgeon in Boston," Audrey replied, her voice eerily calm. She turned to look at Nico. He looked dreadful. The adrenaline crash was setting in, draining the color from his face, leaving his skin pale beneath the smears of soot and blood. His hands were still trembling slightly, a microscopic tremor that only someone who studied him intimately would ever notice. You, on the other hand, look like a corpse. I feel like one, Nico admitted, a dark, cynical half-smile ghosting across his lips. Come on, she said, reaching out to take his hand. His knuckles were raw, the skin split open across the joints. She didn't squeeze. She just guided him out of the bright, interrogating light of the foyer and into the dark sanctuary of the master bedroom. The transition from the cold hallway to the bathroom was silent. Audrey turned on the heavy brass fixtures in the massive walk-in shower. The water hit the black slate tiles, quickly filling the enclosed glass space with thick, suffocating steam. She didn't ask questions about the warehouse. She didn't want to know the names of the men he had killed or how many bullets he had fired. That was the currency of the street, and it had no place in this room. Nico stood rigidly by the granite counter. He managed to unholster his weapon, placing the heavy Sig Sauer down with a loud metallic clatter. He tried to pull his ruined jacket off his shoulders, but a sharp hiss of pain escaped his teeth. He stopped, his right arm hanging limply at his side. "Stop," Audrey ordered softly. She stepped into his space. Her hands were steady now. She pushed his hands away and carefully peeled the ruined, blood-soaked wool jacket off his wide shoulders. It fell to the tile floor with a heavy, wet slap. His white dress shirt was next. The buttons were already torn, making it easier to pull the fabric away from his skin. Underneath, his torso was a canvas of dark, blooming bruises. A massive, purplish-black contusion spanned the entire left side of his ribcage, shaped vaguely like the heavy toe of a combat boot. Audrey traced the edge of the bruise with a feather-light touch. Nico's stomach muscles violently contracted beneath her fingertips. He sucked in a sharp, ragged breath, his dark eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Nothing is broken," Nico murmured, his voice strained. "Just deep tissue trauma." "Get in," she told him, pointing to the steaming shower. Nico stepped under the scalding water in his slacks. The heavy spray instantly turned a light, rusty pink as it washed the blood and dirt from his skin, swirling down the dark drain in a morbid watercolor. Audrey didn't hesitate. She kicked off her boots, pulled her heavy wool sweater over her head, and stepped into the shower with him in her jeans and tank top. She didn't care about the clothes. She only cared about the man standing under the water, desperately trying to wash away the violence of the night. She took the heavy bar of cedarwood soap from the niche and worked it into a thick lather between her hands. She started with his back, pressing her palms against the tense, rigid muscles of his shoulders. Nico leaned forward, bracing his heavy hands against the black slate wall, bowing his head under the relentless stream of hot water. He let out a long, shuddering sigh as her hands worked methodically over his skin, scrubbing away the grime, the ash, and the physical evidence of his absolute brutality. "Dominic Rossi is going to retaliate," Nico spoke into the wet slate wall, his voice echoing loudly over the sound of the rushing water. "He's the older brother. He runs the port operations. He's smarter than Leo, and infinitely more patient. But you don't kill a boss's blood without triggering a war." Audrey rinsed the soap from his broad back, watching the water run clear. She moved to his side, carefully washing his uninjured arm. "I know how syndicate politics work, Nico. Do you?" He turned slowly, putting his back against the wet wall, looking down at her soaked, clinging clothes. The water plastered her dark hair to her skull, making her eyes look impossibly large and incredibly dark. "Because yesterday you were an auditor who kept her hands perfectly clean. You managed the offshore accounts. You didn't manage the body count. That changes tomorrow. If you stay, Dominic will consider you a legitimate target. You're not a civilian anymore, Audrey. You chose the cartel. I chose you," she corrected him, her voice slicing cleanly through the thick steam. She reached up, cupping his wet, bruised face in her small hands. She forced him to hold her gaze. And if Dominic Rossi wants to declare war on this house, he's going to find out exactly how much damage a ruthless accountant can do. Nico stared at her, the dark, cynical exhaustion in his eyes slowly burning away, replaced by a fierce, undeniable awe. He wrapped his wet, heavy arms around her waist, pulling her flush against his battered chest. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted like copper and salt water. It was a vow sealed in the ashes of their old boundaries. Audrey kissed him back with equal ferocity, her fingers tangling in his wet hair, anchoring herself to the monster she had finally decided to embrace. By 7 in the morning, the heavy rain had finally broken, leaving Boston under a suffocating blanket of thick, grey fog. The penthouse was a hive of quiet, lethal activity. The illusion of a peaceful domestic life was entirely gone, replaced by the cold, calculating machinery of a syndicate preparing for an all-out siege. Dante had converted the massive formal dining room into a makeshift war room. 6 heavily armed enforcers stood guard at the various elevator access points and the emergency stairwells. The thick oak front door remained securely locked, the damaged biometric scanner bypassed and hardwired into an analog deadbolt system. Audrey sat at the head of the long mahogany dining table. The canvas duffel bag of practical clothes was gone, unpacked and shoved into the back of her closet. She wore a crisp black silk blouse and tailored slacks. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, unforgiving knot. In front of her sat 2 encrypted laptops, their screens glowing brightly with endless columns of offshore routing numbers, shell company ledgers, and complex maritime shipping manifests. A massive mug of black coffee, her third of the morning, sat cooling next to a stack of printed financial dossiers. Nico stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring down at the foggy city streets. He wore a fresh suit, pitch black and perfectly tailored, hiding the heavy bandages wrapped tightly around his bruised ribs. He looked exactly like the untouchable boss the city feared. The vulnerability of the shower was gone, locked away until the blood stopped flowing. Dante stood adjacent to the table, cleaning the internal mechanisms of a suppressed submachine gun with methodical, almost meditative precision. We lost 3 localized distribution points in the South End over the last 2 hours, Dante reported, without looking up from the oily metal components. His deep voice cut through the quiet clicking of Audrey's rapid typing. Dominic's guys hit the warehouses hard. They didn't take the product, they just burned it. It's a message. He's showing the regional captains that we can't protect our own infrastructure. He wants them to panic. Nico didn't turn around. He kept his dark eyes fixed on the grey horizon. Panic breeds betrayal. If the captains think we're bleeding out, they'll flip to the Rossis to save their own lucrative territories. So we hit back, Dante stated simply, slamming a fresh, fully loaded magazine into the weapon with a sharp, satisfying click. Give me 10 men. I will personally drive to Dominic's estate in Brookline and level the front gates. We cut the head off the snake before it finishes organizing the rest of the body. No, Audrey said loudly. The single word brought the entire room to a dead halt. The 6 guards positioned around the perimeter subtly shifted their weight, their eyes darting toward the table. Nobody interrupted Dante's tactical proposals. Nobody contradicted the head enforcer during wartime. Dante slowly looked up from his weapon, his cold, dead eyes locking onto Audrey with a predatory stillness. Nico finally turned away from the window, his expression unreadable, waiting to see exactly how she would handle the sudden, intense pressure. Audrey didn't flinch under Dante's murderous gaze. She didn't look away. She simply tapped a polished fingernail against the screen of her primary laptop. A frontal assault is exactly what Dominic wants, she explained, her voice steady, authoritative, and entirely stripped of emotion. He knows Nico is aggressive. He expects you to send shooters to Brookline, which means his estate is currently a heavily fortified kill zone. If you take 10 men there, Dante, you will absolutely die on his manicured lawn. Dante's jaw tightened. I don't lose gunfights. You can't shoot a bank account, Audrey countered sharply. She spun the heavy laptop around so the screen faced Nico and Dante. The display showed a complex web of interconnected corporate logos and foreign banking institutions. Dominic Rossi doesn't derive his power from street muscle. He derives his power from his control over the deep-water commercial ports. He smuggles high-value cargo through a network of incredibly legitimate front companies. If we kill him, his lieutenants just take over the infrastructure. The Hydra grows another head. Nico walked slowly toward the table, resting his hands heavily on the polished back of a leather dining chair. What are you suggesting, Audrey? I'm suggesting we strangle him financially before we ever fire another bullet, she said, pulling a thick manila folder from the stack and sliding it across the smooth mahogany wood. I spent the last 4 hours cross-referencing Leo Rossi's personal ledgers with Dominic's corporate filings. Leo was stupid. He kept meticulous, handwritten records of his brother's offshore routing numbers to guarantee his own cut of the maritime profits. I have the digital keys to Dominic's primary Cayman Island holding accounts. Dante stopped wiping the gun oil from his hands. You can freeze his money. I can do much worse than freeze it, Audrey said, a cold, cynical smile touching the very corners of her mouth. I can reroute it. Every single dollar Dominic uses to pay his corrupt dock workers, his customs officials, and his political protection. I can completely drain his operational liquidity and transfer the funds directly into a dozen decentralized, untraceable cryptocurrency wallets. In exactly 3 hours, Dominic Rossi won't have enough liquid cash to pay his own personal bodyguards. The dining room fell into a stunned, absolute silence. The sheer scale of the financial devastation she was casually proposing was terrifying. She wasn't just planning to wound the Rossi family. She was planning to completely dismantle their foundation, leaving them exposed, broke, and entirely vulnerable to the natural predators of the criminal underworld. Nico stared at the complex digital schematics glowing brightly on the laptop screen. He looked at the offshore routing numbers, the shell company structures, and the absolute brilliance of the lethal trap she had quietly constructed while he and Dante were discussing crude bullets and brute force. Slowly, Nico looked up from the glowing screen and met Audrey's eyes. The dark, simmering pride in his expression was completely undeniable. She had finally stopped running. She had stepped fully into the dark arena, wielding a ledger like a loaded shotgun. "Do it!" Nico ordered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent a sudden, thrilling shiver straight down her spine. "Drain every single penny. Take his power, Audrey. Make him bleed." Audrey turned the laptop back around. Her fingers hovered over the dark keyboard for a fraction of a second. The cynical, calculated auditor took a deep breath and pressed enter, executing the massive digital transfer. The ripple effect was officially in motion. The Rossi family was already dead. They just didn't realize their heart had completely stopped beating. The numbers on Audrey's screen didn't bleed. They simply vanished. The lifeblood of the Rossi port monopoly, millions of dollars in operational capital, dissolved into an untraceable matrix of encrypted crypto wallets. Audrey watched the blue progress bar hit 100%. It was a terrifyingly quiet apocalypse. There were no sirens screaming in the distance. There was no thick smoke filling the skyline. Just the soft, steady whir of the laptop's internal cooling fan and the dull, final click of her right thumb pressing the spacebar to officially finalize the irreversible ledger wipe. "It's done," she said, leaning back heavily against the dark mahogany chair. Nico stepped slowly away from the massive window. He didn't smile. The violent tension in his clenched jaw remained absolute. He picked up his porcelain mug of coffee, the dark liquid having turned completely cold, and took a slow, methodical sip. "How long until he actually notices?" "He already has," Audrey replied, rubbing her tired eyes with the heels of her hands. "The automated offshore routing system instantly flags any outgoing transfer over $50,000. Dominic's personal phone has been screaming continuously for the last 12 minutes. His international bankers are entirely locked out. His domestic holding companies are completely insolvent. He is currently standing in a sprawling Brookline mansion he legally no longer owns, realizing he can't even afford to put premium gas in his fleet of armored luxury cars." Dante's encrypted burner phone violently vibrated against the polished wooden table. It was a harsh, rattling sound that shattered the quiet tension. He answered it swiftly, listened in absolute silence for exactly 15 seconds, and abruptly hung up. He looked directly at Nico, a rare, terrifying glint of genuine amusement reflecting in his cold, dead eyes. "Customs inspectors at the southern seaport just walked off the job," Dante reported, his deep, resonant voice slicing cleanly through the quiet room. Dominic's weekly automated payroll bounced hard. The corrupt union boss isn't answering his private calls. 3 massive shipments of uncut product are currently sitting in locked metal cargo containers under the punishing midday sun, and absolutely nobody is lifting a single finger to move them past the federal security checkpoint. His own trusted lieutenants are currently stripping the secondary warehouses of anything remotely valuable and vanishing into the city. "Panic," Nico murmured softly, the dark, predatory satisfaction finally settling deeply into his battered features. "Exactly like you predicted." "Money strictly buys loyalty," Audrey stated, her voice entirely devoid of the painful moral hesitation she had heavily carried just yesterday. "When the money completely stops flowing, the loyalty instantly evaporates. Dominic is bleeding out rapidly, and the sharks are already aggressively circling his sinking ship." Audrey pushed her heavy chair back and stood up slowly. Her stiff legs felt exactly like lead, but her mind was violently, brilliantly awake. She left Nico and Dante to methodically organize the necessary street-level cleanup operations and walked quietly down the long, silent residential hallway toward the east wing. The luxurious guest suite was intensely dark. The heavy velvet blackout curtains pulled incredibly tight against the glaring afternoon sun. The stagnant air smelled sharply of medicinal iodine and freshly washed linen. Ian was lying perfectly still in the absolute center of the massive king-sized bed. His severely bruised face was a swollen, mottled canvas of dark purple and sickly, fading yellow. His good eye flicked open quickly as Audrey quietly approached the mattress. He looked utterly, hopelessly terrified. He wasn't terrified of the Rossi family anymore. He was completely terrified of her. "I heard the armed men talking loudly in the hall," Ian rasped, his cracked voice a broken, painful whisper. He visibly winced as his bandaged chest slowly rose and fell. "They explicitly said you completely crashed Dominic's offshore accounts. They said you systematically stole absolutely everything he possessed." Audrey stood rigidly at the foot of the bed. She didn't reach out to comfort him. She didn't offer a warm, reassuring sibling smile. She looked down at her younger brother with a cold, terrifying clinical detachment that frightened even herself. "I didn't steal it, Ian. I strategically seized it. There is a massive, fundamental difference. One is petty theft. The other is total war. You're a legitimate accountant, Audrey." Hot tears rapidly welled in his one functioning eye, spilling messily over the dark facial bruises. "You're supposed to be the profoundly good one in this family. You were supposed to finally get away from this toxic life. Mum desperately wanted you to get far away. Mum is dead, Audrey said flatly, the harsh words dropping like incredibly heavy stones directly onto the polished hardwood floor. And if I had successfully run away last night, you would absolutely be dead right now too. I explicitly stayed here to save your pathetic life. Do not sit comfortably in my house and dare to judge the ruthless methods I utilized to keep your lungs breathing. Ian swallowed incredibly hard, physically shrinking back against the soft white pillows. What exactly happens now? Now you quietly heal, Audrey instructed, with brutal, absolute coldness. When you can physically walk without collapsing, Dante is going to personally put you on a private, untraceable charter flight directly to Seattle. I discreetly bought a small, failing bakery there under a massive insulated shell corporation. You are going to strictly manage the financial books. You will live a remarkably quiet, agonizingly boring suburban life. You will absolutely never place another illegal bet. You will never speak my name aloud. If you ever contact me, or if you ever owe so much as a basic parking ticket to the wrong dangerous people, Nico won't come for you. Dante will. She turned around sharply, her crisp black silk blouse rustling softly in the uncomfortably quiet room. Audrey, Ian called out desperately, his raw voice cracking under the emotional strain. Are you honestly ever coming back to me? She stopped dead in the doorway, her right hand resting heavily on the cold brass handle. She looked back slowly over her shoulder, the hallway ambient light perfectly catching the sharp, unforgiving, cold angles of her face. I am exactly where I fundamentally belong, she whispered softly. She pulled the heavy wooden door shut, loudly locking him entirely in the dark. When she finally returned to the main foyer, the atmospheric pressure had drastically, violently shifted. The heavy oak front door was entirely unlocked. Nico was standing aggressively in the absolute center of the black marble floor, his ruined suit jacket completely discarded, his black weapon securely holstered at his right hip. Dante stood exactly 10 feet away, a heavily suppressed tactical rifle hanging loosely from a black nylon sling. Standing directly between them, tightly flanked by two of Nico's massively built, heavily armed perimeter guards, was Dominic Rossi. He didn't look anything like a powerful kingpin. He looked exactly like a cornered, desperate animal. His incredibly expensive tailored Italian suit was badly rumpled, his dark silk tie hanging completely loose around his thick, sweating neck. His face was deeply flushed with frantic, desperate, unadulterated anger. He had come here entirely alone. He had absolutely no other choice left. His loyal men had completely abandoned him. His bank accounts were entirely zeroed out, and his younger brother was completely dead. He was a walking ghost, foolishly stepping straight into an active graveyard. Audrey stopped quietly at the edge of the hallway, her arms securely crossed over her chest. "Where the hell is it?" Dominic violently spat, his deep voice trembling noticeably with a volatile mixture of pure rage and absolute physical exhaustion. He ignored Nico completely, locking his red, bloodshot eyes directly onto Audrey's face. $40 million in liquid cash assets, 3 entire generations of port infrastructure, completely gone in 10 minutes. Where the hell did you put my money? Nico stepped aggressively and smoothly into Dominic's direct line of sight, completely blocking his view of Audrey. The protective movement was intensely possessive, quietly lethal, and completely silent. "You don't dare talk to her!" Nico rumbled aggressively, the dark gravel in his voice dropping an entire terrifying octave. "You talk directly to me. You walked voluntarily into my home, Dominic, right after your stupid brother touched exactly what was completely mine. You are currently breathing right now strictly because I am temporarily allowing it. You brutally killed Leo!" Dominic roared loudly, taking a highly reckless, aggressive half-step forward. Dante instantly raised the heavy rifle, the bright laser sight painting a glowing red dot directly onto the exact center of Dominic's sweating forehead. Dominic instantly froze, his broad chest heaving heavily. Leo was a massive idiot, but he was my actual blood. And you violently slaughtered him inside a dirty warehouse over a profoundly stupid gambling debt. He arrogantly put his dirty hands on Ian. Nico corrected with absolute coldness. He openly threatened Audrey's life. That wasn't a standard debt collection. That was a finalized suicide note. Nico slowly tilted his head, his dark, calculating eyes thoroughly analyzing the broken, desperate man standing helplessly in front of him. You specifically came here to beg for your life, Dominic. So aggressively beg. Tell me exactly why I shouldn't let Dante completely paint this marble foyer with your brains right now. Dominic's broad shoulders completely slumped. The violent anger visibly bled out of him, rapidly replaced by the crushing, suffocating weight of his absolute, undeniable defeat. I have absolutely nothing left. The money is entirely gone. The corrupt politicians absolutely won't return my panicked calls. My own trusted lieutenants are aggressively dividing up my remaining territory as we speak. You completely won the war. I just desperately want out. Give me enough liquid cash to permanently disappear to Eastern Europe, and I swear on my dead mother's grave you will absolutely never see my face again. I'll legally sign over the commercial port contracts. I'll freely give you the lucrative customs routes. Just please, let me safely walk away. Nico didn't answer him immediately. He looked slowly back at Audrey. He wasn't silently asking for permission. He was deeply asking for her final, absolute judgment. The brutal, undisputed street boss was completely deferring to the ruthless, calculating auditor. Audrey slowly, deliberately uncrossed her arms. She walked confidently forward, her sharp heels clicking aggressively and loudly against the highly polished black marble. The rhythmic sound was deafening in the intensely tense, completely quiet room. She stopped exactly beside Nico, standing proudly shoulder to shoulder with the violent monster she entirely loved. She looked coldly at Dominic. She didn't see a grieving, desperate brother. She didn't see a formidable rival boss. She just saw a remarkably bad financial investment, an obsolete, highly toxic ledger entry that desperately needed to be permanently, violently erased. The lucrative port contracts are already securely mine, Audrey stated, her voice as brutally cold and perfectly clear as winter ice. I flawlessly forged your digital signature on the necessary transfer documents exactly 2 hours ago. The highly valuable customs routes are completely useless to you without the union payroll, which I completely control now. You have absolutely nothing left to trade, Dominic. You have absolute zero leverage here. Dominic stared intensely at her, genuine, unadulterated horror washing heavily over his flushed, sweating face. He finally realized the completely terrifying, undeniable truth. Nico Moretti was merely the violent muscle, but this quiet, profoundly calculating woman was the absolute, undeniable architect of his total, catastrophic destruction. You're an absolute monster, Dominic desperately whispered, his voice trembling violently under the weight of his realization. Audrey didn't flinch or look away. She just smiled. It was a dark, incredibly chilling expression that absolutely didn't reach her cold eyes. I'm merely an accountant, she corrected him softly. I just meticulously balance the ledgers. She turned her head slightly, looking affectionately up at Nico's bruised, heavily battered profile. The ledger is completely closed, she told him very quietly. Nico understood exactly what she meant. He absolutely didn't hesitate. He didn't offer a final, gloating monologue. He aggressively and smoothly drew the heavy, matte black Sig Sauer from his hip holster, leveled it precisely at Dominic's chest, and pulled the trigger exactly twice. The heavily suppressed gunshots echoed dully in the massive, cavernous foyer. Dominic Rossi collapsed heavily onto the cold black marble, his dark blood pooling instantly, flawlessly mirroring the exact precise spot where Audrey's canvas duffel bag had spilled its contents just 12 chaotic hours prior. The violent war was officially, permanently over. Dante didn't say a single word. He sharply gestured to the two armed guards, who quickly stepped forward in unison, grabbed Dominic's heavy, lifeless body by the arms, and dragged him quietly and efficiently toward the waiting private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid shut with a soft chime, leaving behind a thick, wet streak of dark red blood completely across the pristine, polished floor. Nico slowly, methodically holstered his weapon. The sharp, metallic click was the loudest absolute sound in the entirely empty room. He turned slowly to face Audrey. His broad chest was heaving slightly, the rushing adrenaline of the final, decisive kill coursing heavily through his completely exhausted veins. He reached out gently, his rough, blood-stained fingers gently touching her pale, flawless cheek. She leaned heavily into his warm touch, completely, entirely unbothered by the violence that coated his large hands. "Are you perfectly okay?" Nico asked softly, his voice a low, incredibly intimate rumble meant exclusively for her ears. Audrey looked down at the dark streak of blood on the floor, then slowly up into the dark, infinitely dangerous eyes of the violent man she had permanently bound her soul to. The lingering guilt was completely, utterly gone. The deep, lingering fear was entirely, completely eradicated. The frightened woman who had nervously packed practical, heavy sweaters and desperately intended to run away in the dark rain simply no longer existed. She had been brutally burned alive in the white-hot crucible of his violent, bloody world, and something entirely new, something terrifyingly cold and absolutely, undeniably powerful had forcefully emerged from the settling ashes. "I'm absolutely perfect," Audrey whispered breathlessly, stepping deeply forward to press her soft lips aggressively against his in the incredibly quiet, bloody aftermath. The heavy, reinforced oak door remained entirely locked behind them, sealing them completely together in the dark forever. The ledger is permanently closed, and Audrey has finally embraced the violent darkness she once desperately tried to outrun. What started as a panicked, midnight escape ended with her ruthlessly ruling an empire of ashes alongside the monster she loves. If you felt the tension of this slow-burn Mafia romance and want more intense, unapologetic crime dramas, hit that like button and share this story with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell notifications so you never miss our dark, thrilling tales. Would you have stayed with Nico? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.